Okay, I'm so excited. We are now at the end, the chilling conclusion, maybe thrilling conclusion to the end of plant reproduction. So let's finish this up and then we'll see another phylogeny. So um, we ended going through all of the basic life cycles that we find in plants, ending with the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, the cone-producing plants and the flowering plants. Need to talk a little bit more about flowers and fruit. When it comes to flowering plants, obviously the most important synapomorphy is going to be flowers, but it's more complicated than that. First, the two most important parts of a flower are the sporangia, and we'll just call them the male and female sporangia now, that produce the male and female spores that become the pollen and seed. So we can, in a way, simplify this and say we're focusing on the parts of the flowers that ultimately produce the pollen and the seeds. And those organs are called the stamen and the carpel. And in a way, the stamen is the organ in the flower. And I should step back. Technically, a flower is an organ, but it's really like a composite of a bunch of organs. It's like really all of the reproductive organ systems together with lots of little stuff going on. But the male part is the stamen. That ultimately is what produces the pollen. That's kind of the male organ. And then the part that produces the seed is the carpel. And the way I remember them is the stamen sticks out, ST, from the flower. And then the carpel, the name carpel basically means body, corpse, and is in the base of the flower, typically. Tons of variation in this. There's like 250,000 species of flowering plants. So a lot of diversity in the flowers because when it comes to diversity, often it comes down to reproduction, and reproduction in flowers is going to be controlled, sorry, in flowering plants is going to be controlled by flowers. The evolution of flowering plants and the evolution of flowers themselves is really, you could spend a whole week on that one topic, but the thinking today is that the ways that flowers evolved is you had something like clusters of leaves that were surrounding reproductive parts that produced seeds and pollen, and then over time they evolved to have a certain morphology whose job is to attract largely animals, either with free food like nectar, which is sugar water, or sap, but it's now inside the flower, or in other ways like patterns and colors and things like that. The basic anatomy of a typical flower is going to have four basic parts. There's lots of anatomy within these parts as well, which we don't need to cover. But on the outside of the flower are sepals, which basically are leaves. They're typically green, although they don't have to be. Then petals. The things that you call rose petals are petals, so that is the correct name. They're usually brightly colored. And then we've got the big reproductive parts, the stamen and the carpel. And so if we look at a typical flower, this is the flower of an iris. The green stuff that looks like a leaf, but is technically part of the flower itself, are the sepals. And then just inside of that are the ring of the petals that tend to be quite large and brightly colored. And then we've got the reproductive parts, the stamen, which is ultimately producing the pollen. And again, it has subparts as well. Um, and then the carpel, which is deep in the middle of the flower and ultimately where the seed is produced. Okay, so basically, if you look at a flower from the outside in, it's basically like almost like a little universe of planetary rings going to the sun in the middle. We've got sepals, petals, stamen, and the sun in this analogy is the carpel. So if you look at different flowers, there's enormous diversity. But at the basics, they've all got the same body parts. So in this flower, you can see the side, the green stuff at the base are the sepals. Then we've got our petals. We have our sticky out stamens that produce the pollen. And then deep in the middle is the carpel. And once you've seen that in one flower, it's basically true in all of them. So from these views, you can't really see the sepals, but the sepals are there. This one has 5 rings of petals. The yellow part is the pollen producing stamens, and then deep inside the middle of the flower, the carpel. The yellow sticky outs are the stamens. We've got 5 petals. You can't see the sepals, the carpels in the middle. Some flowers are composite flowers. These 3 here are called composite flowers, where it's not just one flower, but it's a bunch of flowers all bundled together. So things like dandelions or sunflowers are composites. And so here, each little part has sepals, the green, the purple and white are the petals, the sticky out stamens, and then in the middle, the carpels. This is a flower that's a lily, has one petal and one really complicated uh, stamen in here, and deep in the middle is the carpel. And typically, if you look at the world of flowers, what you'll see is that they're all in multiples, usually of threes, fours, or fives, with again some variation like this one here. And so if you look here, this isn't a five. This one's a composite flower, so you can't really use that rule there. But this one here, each individual part of the composite, in this case, is probably a five. This is a five. A little bit hard to see, but this looks like it's a, I can't tell on that one. This is a five, that's a five. This looks like a six, but remember I said they come in threes, fours, or fives. This one's a tricky one. If you look carefully, these two are not the same. And in fact, this one is just outside. So here we have three sepals, but here the sepals are white. They're kind of mimicking the petals. Then we've got three petals. And then if you count the stamens, there are six. But if you follow them down, it's like the letter Y. They start off as one, then they branch into two. So this is a three-part symmetry. And it will turn out when we do the next set of modules, when we go through the diversity of plants, the symmetry of the flower and the fruit that develops from the flower is critically important. Okay, just to give you a sense of this, that a typical apple has five-part symmetry and its flower had five-part symmetry. A banana has three-part symmetry and its flower had three-part symmetry. So we're going to see a consistency of these. All flowers, if it's a true flower, has sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. The stamens produce the pollen. They could be wind dispersed or animal dispersed, and then the carpel is where that pollen eventually works its way in, and the carpel produces the seed. Fertilization occurs. Okay, now let's talk about pollination syndrome. So typically when people hear the word syndrome, they think of an illness, but technically a syndrome are a set of characteristics that help you diagnose something. So if you've got a fever and a rash and a sore throat, okay, you might have this illness. If you don't have the sore throat but still have a fever, you might have a different illness. That's a syndrome. A pollination syndrome, when used this way, is basically trying to understand the way in which the flower is pollinated. And technically this works also for ferns and things like that, but because they don't have pollen, it's spores. In most of plants, until we get to the flowering plants, the pollination or the movement of spores is dispersed by the wind. And we think that's the ancestral way for all of the early plants, and still a lot of seed plants and flowering plants like the grasses are all wind dispersed. And this is a pretty wasteful way of doing it. You produce a ton of spores or pollen, and the vast majority are never going to find a flower or a recipient in their same species, and so it's going to be wasted. And so this is not very efficient. But if you live in an environment with not many animals, or it's very windy, this could be a good strategy. Or if you're a moss or a fern where you're not using specialized syndromes, this is your only option. Remember, this is for the spore side of things. For gametes, it's always water. So sperm always needs water. Either it swims outside the plant to go find where the eggs are, or it's swimming inside the seed, which still has some moisture for that sperm to swim. But when we get to the flowering plants, we can now do fancier things. And specifically, what we can do is flowering plants can use the sensory know-how of animals. Animals have nerves, which means they have sensory systems, which means they can see things, they can smell things, they can hear things. And because of the sensory systems of animals, they can identify this flower and this flower look the same, and because they look the same, they're probably in the same species. And so flowers, in a way, have learned to take advantage of the sensory abilities of animals and use animals to pollinate them. And so these are different syndromes. So I'm going to go through it quickly, but we'll see examples. So a bee-pollinated flower, the flowers tend to be yellow or blue because if you're a bee, these colors are the most vibrant. Think about you as a human. For most humans, unless you're red-green colorblind, bright colors, red, orange, yellow, stick out to you. If you're looking in a green tropical rainforest, it's pretty dark, red's going to stick out to you, okay? Because that's a primate thing. For bees, yellow and blue, they're very sensitive to it. And a lot of insects can also see ultraviolet, which as primates, we can't see. Okay, so they'll see colors that are below. If you think of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, above violet is a color which you can't see, but some insects and some fish and birds can see. It's called ultraviolet. What's it look like? Can't describe it to you. It's like asking a blind person, what does red look like? If you're blind, you can't really describe how colors are different. But there's a color that insects can see, and bees especially, above violet, called ultraviolet. In fact, there's a color below red as well. It's called infrared. Again, we can't see it, but some things can. Butterflies, they're very sensitive to lavender and pastel colors and pink. And butterflies are terrible flyers, so the flower typically has a big landing pad of petals, so the butterfly can kind of rest there while it gets a lot of nectar. In the case of bees, they can't smell very well, so there's not much nectar, there's not much smell. Butterflies smell really amazingly well, incredibly well, so there's going to be a lot of nectar and it's going to be floral. Um, Birds, typically in North America and the New World, we're talking about hummingbirds, but in Africa and Australia, there are other birds like honey catchers that play this role, but they're moving pollen from one flower to another. Birds, like primates, can see bright red colors and orange colors, and they need lots of nectar. I'm not going to go into the story of hummingbirds right now, but hummingbirds are physiologically insane. They need enormous amounts of nectar to survive, the equivalent of you within 75 minutes eating or drinking 4 gallons of soda. And if you don't, you're going to starve to death. That's how physiologically hardwired hummingbirds are. Birds can't smell worth a darn, and so the nectar is basically flavorless and smellless. And then there also are flowers that open at night and are pollinated by nocturnal animals. And the rules follow the hummingbird and butterfly, but for nocturnal things. And so for bats, at night you can't see color, so the flowers are very pale white and they open at night. So instead of a flower being open during the day when birds and butterflies are active, they're going to open at night when these pollinators are active. There's typically a landing pad for the moths, just like in butterflies, but not a landing pad for the birds or the bats because they can kind of carry themselves. So let's see some pictures. This is what a classical bee pollinated flower looks like. It tends to be yellows and blues is the normal colors because they're attracted to them. And the way the bee sees it, what looks to you is just yellow has another color that you can't identify. It's above violet, it's called ultraviolet, and we can mimic that pattern with a black light. But the colors we can't. So this is like fake colors, but you can see that there's like a bullseye. So when the bee is flying around, it basically like, oh, last time I was at a flower that looked like this, I got some free food, some pollen, some other things that I can use to feed and make honey. And so I'll remember that because insects are smart, they've got a big brain. And when I see a flower that looks like that again, it rewarded me last time, it'll reward me again. In the process, the bee has some pollen on it, and so when it finds that flower, the same species again comes back to it for more food, the flower's reproducing. So bee thinks it's gaining food, but really the flower's getting the bigger reward because it's getting to reproduce and only putting pollen in an animal that's only going to come back to that kind of species. So it's an incredibly efficient way of pollinating. Again, manipulating animals in order to have very efficient reproduction. These are what the flowers of butterflies often look like, lavender colors, pastel colors with a landing pad, and typically a very long carpel with nectar at the base, and they have a very long nose or proboscis that they can push down to get their nectar, and typically very fragrant, perfumey. A lot of the famous perfumes, vanilla, jasmine, come from butterfly and moth pollinated flowers. The hummingbird pollinated ones tend to be red and crimson, with also a lot of nectar, but no landing pads. And then we've got the nocturnal ones that open at night and basically follow the same rules. Landing pads for the moths, which are very much like butterflies, and then no landing pad for the bats. Okay, we're almost done with plant reproduction, just got to cover fruit, and we'll do that in a second.